And I'll start off by thanking the organizers of Karshan for inviting me to participate in this series of talks on fascism in India. And the first thing which has to be stressed here is that fascism, though we can speak of fascism in general and distinguish it from bourgeois democracy by the common features it has, but in each and every occasion, it has its own specificities. So, for example, Nazi fascism of Hitler and all that, has its distinct features, which you might find some similarities with Mussolini's fascism, but at the same time it is still distinct from it. Or if you come to the case of India, the fascist rule that we had to suffer under Indira Gandhi for a period of nearly 2 years has its own particularities, which are quite different from the fascism that is now attempting to establish itself in our country. Brahminical Hindu fascism that has been spearheaded by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS. It's important to keep this in mind because one has to understand the specific context in which they have come. There are certain similarities which I'll come to later in between the Indira Gandhi's fascist rule and the present one threatening us. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind these distinctions that they emerge from a particular situation, a particular political, economic situation, social situation. The second point is the distinction we have to make between the fascism seen in capitalist or imperialist countries and the one that is seen in oppressed nations like India. Now, presently, with this influence of post-colonialism, it has become quite fashionable to speak about a post-colonial India. Not in the sense of a time period that you are speaking about India in a period after colonialism, formal colonialism was ended, but rather as something that is beyond colonialism. The post there meaning some sort of a beyond colonialism sort of thing, which in essence eliminates the neo-colonial reality that we are living under. As the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, had pointed out in the debate with the Soviet revolutionists, neo-colonialism is a more pernicious form of colonialism in the sense that formally colonial rule has been ended, but it continues as indirect control and indirect exploitation and plunder. So the important thing in relation to the topic that is being discussed, that is of fascism, is that in an imperialist country, fascism is a form of rule of the monopoly bourgeoisie, just as much as bourgeois democracy was. In a particular situation, facing a crisis or the threat of a revolutionary upsurge or takeover, the ruling classes opt to end formal democracy, the so-called law, rule of law, and replace it with outright force, where teachers commonly seen in the feudal period, where rather than rule of law prevails, it is a rule by edict that prevails. So this definitely is a break from the bourgeois democratic system that was operating there and the constitutional rights that were formally being granted to the citizens and all that. But at the same time, it has its basis there, just as much as bourgeois democracy had its basis in the transition to capitalism from feudalism. Fascism too has its basis in that very same transition. It is not identical to a feudal system. But when we come to an oppressed country, there is the situation that you don't have though you might have a parliamentary system, and a parliamentary system that is existing for decades together, like what you see in India, you don't have bourgeois democracy because the transition to capitalism has not taken place. You will see a lot of features of capitalism, both in the economic relations as well as in the superstructural relations and institutions and all that. Things which formally resemble those that are seen in a capitalist country. But this essentially is not a bourgeois democracy that emerges, that is established through the dismantling of or the overthrow of or the transition or transformation from a feudal caste, what was existing here, the caste feudal social system. So this distinction is very important because though you have this formal democratic system set up, one man, one vote, or one citizen, one vote, and freedom of speech, etc., rights enshrined in the constitution, rule of law, the judicial oversight, etc., and all that. Along with that, many features of caste feudalism persist not as aberrations or distortions or deviations from the norm, but rather as very much as part of this whole system itself. So the transformation from formal parliamentary system, formal system which resembles bourgeois democracy, to an outright fascist system, though that of course is an event, it's a qualitative transition which stands out. It is at the same time carries along with it a lot of what was already existing. It will be worthwhile here to recollect what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had pointed out while examining the significance or the import of the bourgeois democratic principle of one citizen, one vote in a country like ours where the caste system prevails, continues. He pointed out that in the normal case, that principle of bourgeois democracy would lead to a political majority. But in our reality, where we have the caste system, what it does is to recreate a communal majority. Now, what he meant by a political majority is something that can be changed through the ballot. Whoever gets the majority gets to rule. And what he meant by a communal majority is a majority that remains unchanged. No matter who comes to power, that majority, precisely composed of casteist elements, remains unchanged. And if you look at the Indian Parliament, and if you make a caste analysis of its members of Parliament over the whole period from 1950 all the way up to now, you can see that the Savarna domination has continued, has persisted, despite the number of times that the ruling party has changed. Of course, there was a long spell of Congress rule, but then that was broken. You had the Janata, then they had the United Front, again UPA, and then now the BJP-led NDA and all that. Throughout all of this, the Savarna majority has remained unchanged, which is precisely the communal majority that was indicated by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Of course, he did not go on to draw the logical conclusion out of this, that what exists is not Bhusha democracy, and that this is a just the pretense of it, the facade, and one really has to carry out a democratic revolution and all that. But still, that observation he made brings up this point that what we see apparently is not the real essence of the whole matter. And therefore, aspects and elements of the feudal system of rule of through edict and all that, have persisted well within this whole system, where formally you had the rule of law, the constitution, and the rights prescribed by the constitution, whereas for the large majority of the population, of the citizens who were supposed to be equal before law and all that, what really existed was the dictates of the local feudal lord. Now that dictate can come either in the form of the traditional feudal lord exercising its power through his own private armies or gundas and all that, or it can come through a political party, like for example what it was in Bengal, or what it is in Bengal even now, and in many other parts of the country. In Kerala, for example, where you have the CPM dominating at the rural level through its complex networks of cooperative societies, various trade unions, various mass organizations, etc., and all that. So that in the so-called party villages, no one opposed to the CPM could have a normal existence. Of course, it did not go to the extent it had gone in West Bengal, where people were simply removed from all records and were rendered a non-citizen. But as far as the practicability is concerned, that was there. So what I'm trying to point out is that this, when we speak of fascism in our context, one has to keep in mind that the swing over, it's a more of a continuum rather than a very sharp break from a democratic situation to a dictatorial situation where we have no rights and all that. Though, as I pointed out earlier, there is a break. It's not that there is not at all a break. There is a break in the sense that the formal ending of that system that is existing, and the formal beginning of a system where you have a dictatorial thing implemented or carried out as a matter of a formally recognized thing, like for example the declaration of emergency by the Indira Gandhi regime and all that. So this aspect one has to keep in mind while discussing fascism in our context as compared to that of capitalist or imperialist countries. Now, here another issue I think you have to keep in mind is the necessity of addressing the question of fascism from a class standpoint, analyzing which are the classes or which is the class which benefits out of this, and what is the specific crisis or context forcing this class to adopt this sort of a political dispensation. Here I think one should also keep in mind that or try to examine this question of the Indian parliamentary system, which compared to almost all other third world countries, oppressed countries, this has existed over decades together. Now this has led quite a number of political scientists to come to the conclusion that there is a distinct characteristic of Indian democracy which sets it apart from the other oppressed nations or the system of parliamentary system in other oppressed nations. and that this is a result of the independence movement, an anti-British movement led by the Congress and all that. And particularly the role of Gandhi and Nehru and all that is highlighted in this matter. Now, I think that if you look at it closely, you can see that the very reason for the existence of the parliamentary system is quite related to the class necessities of the ruling classes of India. I mean, what was it, for example, what was it that led Indira Gandhi to declare a general elections and try to legitimize her dictatorial regime through that election? Obviously, she was not planning to lift emergency, but rather she was trying to legitimize it through that election. But she failed in that for whatever reason, and we need not go into that here. I think the main reason for doing that is precisely because in a country like India, this is very much necessary for the ruling classes. Because unlike other countries, the Indian ruling classes do not have a homogeneous social basis, whether it be a nationality or a specific religious group, community, or in any other manner. You do not have a homogeneous social base. This is a weakness, an inherent weakness of the Indian ruling classes. Even if you try to put it in terms of the Savarna, there again you have hundreds of castes. Apart from the Varna division of Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, all these are quite general terms which actually encompass any number of castes, which again are quite specific, either related to a nationality, I mean seen only in a specific nationality, like for example you see the Nayars only in Kerala or the Iyengars only in Tamil Nadu, or some specific cultural region, like for example if you take the case of Bihar, you have the Bhumihars and all that. So this Savarna as such cannot, though it provides a certain basis, it cannot provide a very solid, cohesive social basis for the ruling classes. And region-wise, Hindu as such definitely cannot do that for very obvious reasons of the caste divisions existing within. Now this is quite different. If you say, for example, you look at our neighboring countries. Bengal, there is the Bengali nationality, which is homogeneous and has, homogeneous in the sense that there is a nationality, a common nationality. Of course, there are other minority nationalities there, but the predominant nationality, there is a predominant nationality, Bengali nationality, which forms the basis of the Bengali ruling classes of Bangladesh. If you go to Sri Lanka, you have the Sinhala nationality, the Buddhist religion, which forms the basis of the ruling classes of Sri Lanka. If you go to Pakistan, it is the Punjabi Muslim community, upper caste Muslim community that forms the basis of the Pakistani ruling class. Unlike this, you do not have anything of that here in India. And therefore, it's very important for the ruling classes to ensure the stability of their rule by having a system which can incorporate all these diverse interests to some degree under their overall hegemony. And the parliamentary system is suited for that because it allows the ruling classes to provide space, political as well as other type of spaces, for the various interests at all levels under the overall hegemony that they exercise. And I think it's precisely because of this that, along with the emergency, which suspended the existing constitution, many provisions of the existing constitution, Indira Gandhi made constitutional amendments and tried to carry out an election which would legitimize that. So that she would have a system where, on the one hand, there is a switchover from the earlier system and there is a more dictatorial control and rule, but at the same time providing space to these diverse interests so that they are also incorporated into the whole system of rule of the ruling classes. This is I think, the real basis for the stability, relative stability of the parliamentary system in India. So then what is it that led the Indira Gandhi regime to formally end the existing parliamentary system's rule by law, suspend the provisions of the constitution, and carry out a fascist rule? And similarly, what is it that we see now presently in the attempt being made by the RSS to the Modi government to impose a fascist rule formally within the country? As I pointed out earlier, the necessity of doing this in class terms is, the crisis that is, or the problems or the situation, the compulsions faced by the ruling classes. And I'm trying to understand fascism in those terms. Now, the importance of doing this, I think, can be seen in certain attempts being made from this broad post-colonial theorization to analyze events in our country from a standpoint which eliminates class. For example, attempts have been made to explain this hate culture, this hate politics that we see growing around us under the Modi regime particularly, in terms of Foucault's biopolitics and his concept of governmentality and all that. I have criticized this in detail in one of the essays I have written, which has been published in a book recently. But I will just point out the salient matter here, the most relevant point here, which is that this person who analyzes this thing in these terms of governmentality and all that ends up by claiming that this hate culture, this hate vigilantism and all that we see around us is actually a result of the handing over of power, dispersal of power to the population at large, as has been explained by the concept of governmentality of Foucault. Now, as a result, he claims that the issue of defining who is an anti-national and who is a national, who is a patriot and who is a traitor, and all that has been is no longer the prerogative of the state or the government in power, but rather of the population at large, which absolves it from all legal obligations or the normal due procedure of law and all that, and allows it to take things into its hand and carry out whatever it wishes. Now, this whole stress of the population at large, of the population, etc., and all that, first of all, it avoids any examination of which are the classes involved. Second, it avoids any analysis of the political interests that are involved. And third, as a result of it, it is able to exclude Modi and the BJP regime from these activities. It ends up by arguing that Modi is able to act as statesman precisely because of this functioning of this governmentality. But we very well know that the vigilante activities, is hate culture, is being orchestrated by the RSS in a very planned, conscious manner through its numerous small organizations, frontal organizations, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the BJP governments, whether at the center or at the state, are also complicit in this through their inaction or their police action which actually harass or repress the victims than the aggressors more. So this interrelation between this whole thing, that this is all part of a larger grand plan being carried out by the RSS, that is simply eliminated in this whole analysis. And this precisely is the problem with this, what I've characterized as post-isms, this whole series of theories of post-colonialism and post-this and post-that and all that. Because by eliminating any analysis or any synthesis of the totality, by simply focusing on its various aspects or its various elements, the actual essence of the matter is missed. And in this case, the emergence of Brahminical Hindu fascism and its effort or its attempt to establish itself as the legitimate expression of the Indian ruling classes hegemony, the reasons which led up to it, all these things are eliminated in this whole analysis. And that is why I stress that it is very important that we keep in mind the class interests that underlie these attempts, which are the classes which are trying to do this, what is the reason, what is the compulsion they face for this. Because if it's when we analyze it in this manner and take a larger perspective, going all the way back to this anti-British struggle period itself, that we can see that at different phases of that struggle, as well as the period after 1947, when there was a formal handing over of power, at various points, the ruling classes have adopted these policies in the face of a crisis of legitimacy that they have faced. So this is the matter that I think we should examine in depth when we try to understand fascism in the present context in our country. If we, I had mentioned the Brahminical Hindu fascism, so I think it's necessary to explain that term. Brahminism, as I see it, is at the core of the ruling class's ideological outlook, of the ruling classes as a whole, not just of the feudal forces, but of the bureaucrat, comprador, bureaucrat, capitalists also. It is at the core of their ideological outlook. And this Brahminism is something that has been restructured, re-engineered and recast in relation to the necessity, the modern necessities of these classes. It is not the Brahminism of old. It is something that has emerged and developed and refined under colonial rule. So that is why it is necessary to pinpoint its Brahminical feature. The Hindu part of it is because that is how it's presented. It's not, a matter of some particularity of Hinduism as such as a religion, when we speak of it in a broad way, but rather a matter of how it is being presented. And that is why one has to speak of Brahminical Hindu fascism to describe, to properly articulate the characteristic of the present fascist threat that we are facing. Now here, if we look at the whole period of the anti-British struggle, particularly its domination of the Indian National Congress in that whole struggle, you can see that the Brahminism that was expounded by its leadership was not identical throughout. For example, you had a period under Tilak, Gokhale and all, Tilak and Lala Lajpat Rai and all that, the so-called extremists in the Congress. And at that period, the Brahminism was explicit and aggressive. it was in that manner tied up directly to the nationalism that they were trying to develop. In the sense that they were trying to define Indian nationalism, patriotism, in terms of that explicit and aggressive Brahminism as something related to the ancient origins of this country and all that. There itself, there is a lot of borrowing from colonialism, colonial theories, because as we know, there was no such ancient land. It was, even in those days, made up of several different kingdoms, and even the empires that we speak about, like the Gupta and Maurya and all that, did not extend to the whole geographical area what is now within India. So the Brahminism there served them in the sense of creating the picture of an ancient past, of an ancient land, which had its own identity, its own culture, history, and all that, which was lost or which was suppressed by foreign invasion, and which is now again coming back to reclaim that glorious position. So, at this point, this explicit aggressive Brahminism did succeed in attracting a lot of sections of the middle classes as well as the working classes. It will be interesting to know that when Tilak was released from the Mandalay prison, one of the major centers where he was given a welcome as a hero returning to his homeland was in the textile workers' colonies of Mumbai. Because Tilak and Lala Lajpat Rai and all that were considered to be militants who were interested in or who were keen and who were supportive of political activity against British rule, as opposed to the reformists like Gokhale and all that who were still caught up with their petition writing business. And interestingly, it is from among these workers who were giving organizing welcoming ceremonies for Tilak and all that, that many a leader of the CPI later came out. Communist Party of India, Bombay faction. So what I'm saying is that this militancy, this explicit aggressive statement of Brahminism is also serving to appear as some form of nationalist militancy, which is what allows it to gather a broader mass base other than its own class social base. But at the same time, that whole stream of aggressive, explicit Brahminism repackaged as a new form of, as nationalism, it was running into certain obstacles, and precisely the most important thing was that of the awareness that was growing up among the various oppressed castes as well as the various classes, exploited classes and all that, and also the more aware sections among the youth. So we see that around this period, all these forces start organizing themselves separately, independently of the Congress. And it is precisely at that moment, or around that moment, that Gandhi is brought in and slowly built up into the Mahatma. And he brings out a new version of an implicit, moderate form of Brahminism, stressing on its inclusive characteristic. Because Brahminism does have that characteristic, that in its theological basis principles itself, it is able to incorporate the other. Of course, at a lower position within its domination, but still it is able to incorporate it. It is able to give that space to it. Because that is how Brahminism has succeeded in incorporating and establishing itself as a ruling ideology throughout the ages. So this aspect is now played up under Gandhi and later under Nehru and all that. And we have this whole idea that Unity and diversity is the governing principle of the new Indian nation. That has it's been there from ancient times, and now it's more, what do you say, tuned up to correspond to the modern concepts of nationhood and democracy and all these things. So this whole process of giving form to a hegemonic consensus, which would legitimize the rule of the emerging or the classes that were getting ready to take over as the ruling classes from colonialism. This is how that process happened. Now you see that whole thing continuing till the 60s still, but by the 60s, this legitimacy of the ruling classes of the state that they had established starts getting challenged by various movements as well as by the internal contradictions of that whole system. Because ultimately, in the final analysis, it is still a semi-colonial, semi-feudal country. And no matter what it claims about its independence and all these things and about its growth and all that, the fact is that it was dependent on imperialism, and that crisis was inevitable. It would have to emerge at some point or the other. So all these claims started falling flat. The economy started faltering. The hubris of powerful nation, all that took a big blow during the Indochina War of 1962. So altogether, you see a crisis of legitimacy emerging around the end of the 60s, which was reflected in parliamentary elections by the series of defeats suffered by the Congress in several states. This is the whole thing that ultimately led up to the 1975 declaration of emergency by Indira Gandhi as a means of, recasting this whole thing in a new way. So instead of the appeal to the nation and all that, you see now the appeal is focused on an individual. Elections are fought in the name of an individual. The individual is focused as the authority, as the savior of the country and all that. And concepts which are quite foreign in the normal case to bourgeois democracy are now presented as the most correct and valid political principles and social values. So this is also, of course, packaged with a lot of populism in the sense of this 20-point program and all that, which tries to hand out, give some relief to the basic masses and thereby nullify or weaken their resistance. So that whole package that emerged then was populism plus dictatorial rule. But that did not succeed. And for several reasons, both internal as well as external in the sense of the contention between the then two superpowers, ultimately the Indira regime was ended through an election, and the legitimacy of that parliamentary democratic system was re-established. But on the other hand, along with that, there was a big democratic upsurge, in the sense that among the middle classes, a large section of which was apolitical, was drawn into this whole thing. And the earlier struggles that took place that had been largely unnoticed by these sections, like for example the Naxalbari movement, these things started getting attention and people started studying it, writing about it, discussing it. And there was a new awareness of human rights and democracy and all that, which was not there, even though the system formally was existing earlier. This was not something that was expected by the ruling classes. And it took some time for them to adjust to this new reality. They did, of course, after some time, and they started bringing back the old black laws of what do you say, the dictatorial laws like MISA and all that. I think now in a new form like NSA. But again, one by one, all those old dictatorial measures were brought back. Along with that, now an explicit form of Brahminism was being favored by the ruling classes. So we see this in the later part of the Indira government, the post-emergency period of Indira Gandhi's rule, that more and more explicit forms of Brahminism are brought back, are favored by the Congress itself, are promoted, and gradually all sections of the ruling classes and all the political parties representing them are united in the common understanding that there has to be a recasting of the whole legitimacy of the hegemonic consensus, and more explicit forms of Brahminism have to be brought in as compared to the earlier period of, or the interim period of a moderate implicit form of Brahminism. The way in which this was taken up at a broad level, one of the most important means of that was the anti-reservation struggles. Of course, there are economic reasons, social reasons for that, like the lack of employment among the middle class youth, Savarna middle class youth and all that. But the way in which that whole struggle was used as an ideological weapon, as an ideological instrument in the recasting of the hegemonic consensus, that is what is of more importance here, note here. Precisely the attempt was made through various articles, studies, etc., lead articles, editorials, and all the possible propaganda means available to the ruling classes to bring up this question of whether reservation can be continued as a matter of right of the oppressed castes. The most important thing here was the attempt to destabilize or overturn the idea of reservation, ideological understanding of reservation that was existing up till then, where it was presented under the Gandhian understanding as a matter of, prayaschitta, of atonement for the sins committed by the Savarnas in the past towards the oppressed castes. And in that sense, this, since the Savarnas have to do prayaschitta, the oppressed castes have every right to enjoy the benefits of reservation. Of course, this is not the way it is presented normally, in the sense that reservation is something that is described, inscribed in the constitution and all that. But the Savarna concept of reservation, the ideological understanding of reservation among the Savarnas was precisely on these lines, as it had been presented and promoted by Gandhi. But this itself was being challenged. And the challenge was coming up in the sense that by posing it through the Savarna youth, that whether they should continue to pay or continue to suffer in their words for whatever has been done in the past. And therefore that it is now time to end this whole business of reservation and replace it with the concept of merit, so that the meritorious get the jobs or the vacancy for studies and all that, and it is no longer decided on the basis of caste. Now, this directly relates to the question of reservation, but what I'm pointing out is that ideologically what was being done was a recasting of, a challenging of the earlier understanding, ideological understanding, recasting it and trying to bring up a new understanding and ideologically new positioning, where the Savarnas are no longer obliged to, give this right to the oppressed caste, but rather it is now their right to demand jobs and demand educational opportunities and all that, because they are meritorious. So through this exercise, the meritorious aspect, that the Savarnas as such are meritorious, or rather that there is some sense in this whole Varna system and caste system and all that, is getting a new legitimacy. It's getting a new acceptance, and the people's minds are being recast to accept this and adopt this. So this was one of the important measures. The other thing was again this insistence on the integrity of the country. National integration was made into a big issue. Of course, there was also the national movements there of Assam, Punjab, and all that. But apart from that, ideologically, the ruling classes were driving at this whole point of integration, national integration. Again, tying it up with this whole concept of a ancient India, which was once united and strong, but then because of internal divisions, it became weak, and that allowed the foreign colonial powers to come and take over the country, to subjugate the country, and therefore the unity of the country is of paramount importance to continue to safeguard that glorious position that we are now regaining. So there again you see the whole thing of this national integration is again bound up very much with the Brahmanistic concepts of this unity and diversity and all that. And it is now more explicitly spelt out of relating this whole, the unity of the country to the Vedic period and all that sort of thing. So overall, in this period, you see that right at the period of Indira Gandhi's rule itself, during the Congress rule itself, these aspects of the earlier hegemonical consensus were being recast, and the new legitimacy, a new understanding was being slowly brought up, in which you see that all parties of the ruling classes were equally involved. Equally in the sense that all of them were involved. Of course, some were more aggressively promoting it, some were less backward in that matter, but all were agreed on it. For example, you can see that when the CPM held its party congress in 1987 in Trivandrum, Kerala, one of the large billboards put up by the CPM at its congress venue and the surrounding areas was of EMS in the position of Krishna. You might remember that famous picture of Krishna as the charioteer and Arjuna as the warrior in the Mahabharata Yuddha war. So in a similar way, you have the Das capital in the place of Arjuna, and EMS Namboodiripad, the revisionist chieftain of the CPM, theoretician of the CPM, as the charioteer in place of Krishna. Similarly, the various propaganda booths that were put up by the CPM, by the DYFI and various other CPM mass organizations were quite consciously planned and built to look similar to the typical picture of the ashrams of the Brahminic sages that are usually seen in the Amarkada comic books and all that. So what I'm pointing out here is that even a party like the CPM was quite consciously adopting all these symbols of Brahminism in an explicit manner, precisely because of the overall unity that was existing among the various political parties of the ruling classes, that the legitimacy among the hegemonic concerns that was existing till then has to be recast, and in this recasting, an explicit form of Brahminism has to be brought forward. So this is the broader context in which we have to understand the present Modi, the RSS dispensation and all that. Now in this, the difference of the RSS outlook on this matter as well as the other, the sections of the ruling classes, political parties and all that, is that the RSS is not just trying to bring forward and going along with this explicit form of Brahminism, but it is also insisting on making it an aggressively explicit form. Now this aggressiveness is what distinguishes it from the other sections of the ruling classes, political representation of the ruling classes. And this aggressiveness is very much rooted in its own history, going all the way back to the Golwalkar, Savarkar and all that. But it was not accepted then by the ruling classes. It was kept at the margins. But as a result of the internal compulsions faced by the ruling classes, of the crisis they have faced, these forces have been allowed and brought back and given a prime position, and they have now pushed themselves forward to the dominant position. So the particularity, so what I'm trying to drive in is this, that the particularity of the fascism that you're facing now in India is very much related, or it's intrinsically related to the crisis of legitimacy faced by the ruling classes. And this crisis has emerged because of the various mass struggles that have come up, rebellions, armed struggles and all that have come up, as well as the internal contradictions and the limitations of that ruling class in a semi-colonial, semi-feudal country. This is the broad context in which we have to understand the particularities of the fascism that are existing today. Now, before concluding, I would like to draw on this question of how do we face up to this? I mean, what is the, of course, there are popular movements, struggles, etc. All of that are great importance, because ultimately fascism has to be confronted on the streets itself. But apart from that, there is a necessity to build up a powerful counter-hegemonic movement, a counter-hegemony challenging this Brahminism of the ruling classes. And this, I think, the most important way of doing that would be a very conscious attempt to de-Brahminize our own cultures. Because if you look at our languages, our cultures and all these things, it is heavily Brahminized. And this has been unconsciously internalized by the left also. Therefore, with this mistaken understanding that one has to go along with these symbols and motives of the people's religious beliefs, the symbols and belief and the forms of Brahminism are taken over, and they are also incorporated, and therefore the division, the sharp polarization, the sharp division that has to be established between Brahminism and non-Brahminism, the anti-Brahminism, that is missed. And thereby we are getting cut off, we are being cut off from a very powerful democratic tradition that was existing in our various parts of our country, which had a very strong anti-Brahminic, anti-caste content. Again, of course, that varies, it's not the same everywhere, but that was there, and it was present in all the cultural regions, in all the nationalities of this subcontinent. So instead of taking that as our basis, we see that the left, even in the past, has quite unconsciously or without paying proper attention to the matter, internalized a lot of those Brahminisms, styles, its methods, its language and all that, and a conscious break has never been made. This is of great importance that we emphasize and we consciously try to de-Brahminize our cultures. Now, I gave you the example of the CPM's party congress in Kerala and all that. But look at what happened in West Bengal, where a large chunk of the CPM, social basis, just simply switched over to the BJP during the past few years. Now, earlier, of course, there is a factor that the large chunk of the CPM had switched over to the TMC when the TMC was gaining ascendancy. If you, I mean, this is something that is quite possible even in a state like Kerala, which is supposed to be very enlightened and has a more modern outlook and all that. But if you try to, what do you say, go a bit deeper and look at it, you can see that the social milieu of the average CPM local leader and the RSS guy in that place, or that of the Muslim League or the Congress or whatever, are almost identical. They would be participating in the local temple committee or mosque committee or church committee or whatever it is, and there they would be equally reactionary in their behavior, in their handling of the affairs of that institution. There is nothing to distinguish between them, that one is left and the other is right and all that. So in that situation, obviously it is not at all a problem for these people to switch over to the RSS, I mean to the BJP. If you look at the case of Bengal, you see that this puja celebration, with all its Sanskritic, Brahminical rituals and all that, has been a very much a part of the revisionist left's mass culture for decades together. It has never tried to establish a counter to that culture, to build up something new. And it is not that there is any lack of local traditions or anything in Bengal, or for example in any other nationality, which would allow it to do it. So this is a matter of conscious choice, and that choice is very much necessary and of great importance if we are really going to succeed in our fight against this Brahminical Hindu fascist threat. So with that, I will conclude, and people who are interested in raising any questions and all that, we could go into that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Uh, I would ask if people, if they have questions, they can type on the chat screen. So we'll wait for 1 minute for them to type their questions, and then you could start answering. Is that fine, sir? Sir, are you there? Sir, are you there?
Oh, Mike. Yes, I am here.
Yeah, so we just
I
take 1 more minute for people to type their questions in the chat box, uh, and then you can start
Yes,
answering.
that's okay. Yes,
Okay,
that's okay.
okay, okay. Sir, there are two questions in the chat box. I think the others are
Yeah, I saw
coming.
them.
So if you could answer.
Should I start or wait for all to come?
So you could start and then we could have those questions if that is fine with you, sir.
Okay. So this first question is whether it's at all imperative to stick to this label fascism. Does it not dilute our understanding of the time and systems? And I think the second question is also related to that. How is our experience in India different from that of Latin America and Africa? This range of totalitarian regimes that comprise histories of the neo-colonial third world, does this at all help us understanding our situation here in India better? Or would that be a gross misgeneralization? Now, I think the the facility of using fascism as a label is related to the a comparison to what is normally understood as bourgeois democracy or the rule of law and parliamentary system, parliamentary elections and all that, which is now considered to be the normal form of rule in a modern, in a country in this modern period, this present period. And the deviation from this, or the form of rule opposed to this, comes under this generic term fascism. So to the extent that fascism indicates this, I think it's useful. But of course, as I said earlier, we have to be clear that the fascism that emerges in different countries in different periods has its own particularity, and we should go into that. Right? Because this whole problem that is being raised here, does it not dilute our understanding of the time and systems, and how does our experience differ from that of other countries and all that, or whether it's a gross misgeneralization? This can said to be equally applicable to any other term that we use. Say, for example, if you speak about a parliamentary system, if you mean a system where all the citizens have one vote, of a voter, and those who are adults have a vote, and we have political parties contesting elections, etc., and all that is understood as a parliamentary system, then fine. But is the parliamentary system that is existing in Britain identical to that existing in America? Or, for example, in any other country? Not only that you have a presidential form of election in the USA, but what I'm saying is that the whole concept of elections and contestant propaganda, etc., it's quite distinct, it's quite different. So, for example, in America, what you usually hear about the elections initially, right at the very beginning of the whole campaign period, is about how many crores of dollars this candidate or that candidate has managed to collect, because that is what determines who is going to succeed in their propaganda. You don't hear of that in the British elections, you don't hear of that in the French elections. So what I'm trying to point out is that this the term parliamentary system or bourgeois democracy, that also is a very general term. And one has to use these general terms to describe these political phenomena. Always keeping in mind that you are describing something, what is you are abstracting from particularities and using a general term, and therefore it does not indicate everything. One has to go into its particularities to understand it in a specific context. Other than that, I don't think there is any problem with this using this fascism to describe what we are facing today. Say if you, instead of fascism, you replace it with totalitarianism, does it make any difference? I really don't think so, but rather fascism has this characteristic that it is, what do you say, it is not just a totalitarian dictatorship where you have the suspension of the normal citizen rights and all that. There is an ideology, there is an ideological movement, there is a social, a political movement, there is a cultural aspect to it. It comes as a total package, and that is what we saw during fascism in Italy under Mussolini, or under the Hitler Nazi regime in Germany. And interestingly, those were the aspects that were attractive to our Brahminical Hindu fascists like this Govalkar and Savarkar and all that. So I think that fascism as a modern phenomena has certain distinctions which can be commonly seen, and therefore it has to be addressed in those terms. It does not eliminate the particularity. But of course, if somebody is going to use it in that manner, that's a different matter. You forget these particularities and you just generalize it and declare that all of these are fascist and that's all there is to be said about it, then that's a different matter. That's all.
So this is the last question, perhaps, if there aren't any other questions. So we can end with this if you
Okay.
have.
So the question is, how do you look at the new resistance movements which are coming up in India now, the NRC CAA movement and the anti-farm bill movement? Quite promising, and promising in the sense that not only that these movements have come out against these measures adopted by the Modi regime, but the whole protest culture that they have generated, and particularly the fact that it has brought thousands and thousands of youth onto the streets. They're getting politicized through those struggles, more aware of what is happening in this country, and linking up with each other through diverse means. So it's quite promising. And I really don't think that the whole thing is to be narrowed down to identify which are what is the political stand of this force or that force. But the fact that thousands and thousands of people have come out of the streets, that is what matters. Because ultimately that is what is going to generate the, the resistance to the fascist threat that we are facing. So.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Really, thank you. And we would want to speak to you more on other issues whenever you have the time. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.